All right, welcome to another Troubadour podcast episode. Today I will be reading and doing what I call converse with verse on the boat stealing scene from the 1850 Prelude by William Wordsworth. Now, just a little preliminary, I have written an article on this as well on troubadourmag.com. So if you wanted to get the analysis that way, I kind of give a synopsis. I put it into some story with the way that I've experienced it and the way that I understand it, and as well as, what it does for me personally. And then I try to do a kind of close reading at the end, breaking down basically not line by line exactly, but sentence by sentence. So if that appeals to you, then check out, the troubadourmag.com, and you can see the whole scene broken out that way. But I wanted to also do the converse with the verse to kind of read it. Some people prefer that. I'll also so if you aren't watching on YouTube or Facebook, I'll put this on my podcast and you can listen to it there. And again, kind of get the hopefully the whole scope of it. So just a couple things about the Prelude. The Prelude is a really particular document for a lot of reasons. I read a version, a book which is put out, in the last, I don't remember exactly when, couple decades, like maybe even post 2000. And it's called the Prelude, the Four Texts. And so this is something that William Wordsworth worked on throughout his entire adult life. He started writing essentially when he was in Germany. I think he got the idea for it. He actually got the idea before that with working on some stuff with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and they developed an idea for an epic poem, like a multi-part series epic poem to kind of, coincide and even rival Milton's Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, which served as a model for the form and the function that they were going for. But they wanted it to be something that encompassed the times. And part of what encompassed the times, this is the 1790s, is the age of enlightenment, the age of reason, right? This is the peak, the pinnacle. This is, I think it was the 1760s when the encyclopedia, what was put together by Diderot. And this encyclopedia, remember, is compiling every piece of human knowledge into one source. I mean, everything that was known to humans, they wanted to put it into one source. And so what William Wordsworth and Coleridge wanted to do is to kind of have an epic that was about knowledge and about experiencing all the knowledge that is possible to humans. And it's this whole opening up of this cathedral of knowledge and of understanding the world and of living in the world and, of experiencing, not from just a pure scientific standpoint, but from the romantic standpoint of how an individual experiences that. And the Prelude was written originally in 1999 as a 2-part prelude. It's very short. So if you don't want to read the whole 8,000 line epic poem, you can read the 2-part prelude, and it gives you, it also look for the short little introductory poem, Was It For This? Was It For This? And you read that and it's much shorter. I don't know how many lines it is off the top of my head, but it's way shorter. And it's kind of like, the embryo for what the entirety of the Prelude would become to be. Now, so in reading that, he's developing his view of what he wants to create for this big epic. And the Prelude, which he expands in, up until 1805 into the 8,000 line epic. But the whole Prelude is a prelude. It's a before the epic itself. Like it's epic in its own sense, but it's kind of he can thought of it as the antechamber into the chapel. That's what the Prelude was going to be. And then he had the recluse and the excursion. And the excursion, which is finished, is supposedly the great according to John Keats, one of the greatest reasons to live in that era. Like, it's the great thing about being alive in that era. It's that good. And I have not actually read anything but excerpts from it so far. I'm going to be reading it next. But The Recluse, and then he had plans for other epic poems to go with it. He did not quite finish, or he didn't finish. And instead, he basically tinkered on the Prelude from 1805, where he did not publish it, by the way. He wrote it in 1805. He never published the Prelude in his lifetime. And then he tinkered with the 1805 version for the rest of his life until he died at the age of 80 in 1850, which is when it was published. So the reason I talk about that is because he's trying to, I want to get across the idea that he's trying to get this really big epic story. And he puts this in a language that to us is kind of lost on us today to some degree, but this is the language of Milton. So this is the language of big epics. It's still in the, iambic pentameter of Virgil and of, at least how they're translated usually. And I think even in those times of Homer, it was still considered that, but in ancient Greek. And so he's trying to put it in this tradition, but the story isn't about God and the devil, right? That's Milton, where it's Paradise Lost, where it's the devil being cast out and it's the devil's story. It's not that. It's not even about Dante's, exploration of of purgatory and of hell and finally into Paradiso. That's not what Wordsworth is interested in. His theme, get this. This is his theme. This is his original subtitle in a sense, was the growth of a poet's mind. And by a poet, he meant himself. Now, this is really hard for us to grasp because that is one hell of an attempt, right? To say that I'm going, again, this is when epics were taken seriously. Today, people don't even know what an epic really means. But to say that I am going to write an epic on the level of a Milton, or maybe even greater, and it's going to be about me, right? And it's not only going to be about me, but it's going to be about how I became an amazing poet, right? The growth of a poet's mind. It's how I gained my unique individual sensibilities. And so broadly, it is about you could think of it thematically as it is about the growth of a mind. And we can learn a lot from that. We could see that. But this is, I think, such an essence of the romantic sentiment, is the going inward and to examine the insides of a soul as precisely or as intensely as the scientists at this time are examining the external world. So just as Newton is examining optics and he's looking at the actual external objects in space, so Wordsworth is going to turn that same scientific, brilliant, mind on himself, an internal. The romantic French poet, playwright, and novelist Victor Hugo has my favorite quote that I think encapsulates all of this feeling. And that is, there's one thing grander than the sea, that is the sky. There's one thing grander than the sky, that is the interior of the soul. And this is the workshop of the romantics, is going into the soul. Now, that doesn't mean that they're purely internal and they don't have any external objects. They do, but it is a turning inward on an intense level that was not seen before. Okay, so that's all the setup for this poem. Now, this poem is in the two-part version. So if you read the two-part prelude, you will hear this poem, this excerpt. It's a short excerpt called The Boat Stealing Scene. And but it's also in the 1805 text and the 1850 text. So the text that I've read, which took me about a year, I took way too long with it because I was reading all four texts and I read both 1805 and 1850 side by side. So I kept rereading stuff to try to grasp what was going on. I think in the end, it really helped me, but at the time it was very tedious. So the version I have, again, it has one page, the 1805 version, and the next page, the 1850 version, and then it goes like that. So I don't recommend that unless you're going to intensely read it like I was trying to read it. But it, that's how I read it. And again, there is no official way to read it except the 1850 version to some degree, because Wordsworth never published the 1805 version. He never meant it to be published. He never meant the 1799 version to be published. The two-part, really. Like, that was all just for his friends. It wasn't for official purposes. So when we read it and we think of it, we have to keep that in mind, that the 1850 is the closest we could call to an official authorized version that, he wanted to. Because, think of it as like, think of your favorite author, like if you like Ayn Rand, and she didn't finish Atlas Shrugged. And so all we have is a manuscript that she wrote, only 5 years in. And then we're like judging her based on that. That's not quite fair. So we have to take that. But nevertheless, this 1850 version is considered one of the great, if not, or it's considered the greatest romantic epic poem. There aren't that many, but it's considered the great romantic epic poem. So, it's not like he messed that up or anything. Okay, so let's get into a reading of it. I just want to set up that a little bit of what's happening here is, again, this is an excerpt. It happens early. The book is broken down into parts of his life and experiences of his life. And he's kind of, before this scene, he's contemplating, some questions about how he came to be who he is as a person. And more than that, in the previous stanzas, he's asking questions about, how do the emotions, like what I find important in the world, what brings terror or calmness or excitement to me, where does that come from? Like, what is the origins of that? Is that, something that happened before birth? He doesn't believe in that exactly. He doesn't believe that, like, you're born with certain inclinations and desires and with kind of a passive approach to life where things just happen to you, but that you actually have a role, and that your life and the events that happen to you have a role in developing your interests, your passions, the things that you happen to love, and the things that you find important in life. And he has a phrase from another poem that I find helpful. The child is father to the man. The child is father to the man. And what I think he means by that is your passions, your interests, all these things I'm talking about, they're born, they come from, they're begat from your childhood. And by the way, if you've read a lot of self-help books or books trying to help you find a career passion, for instance, often recommend scouring your memory for things that you love to do just to do them, and not necessarily do that exact thing. They don't, say, oh, you liked, building blocks, so you definitely have to be an architect. It's not a one-to-one relationship, but you're trying to find the things that brought you pleasure just in and of themselves when you were younger. And you're trying to find, okay, what can I do today that's similar to that? Like, how can I, what was the essence of that thing that, it's not that I want to be an architect, but I really did like the building of things. So I want to be a part, and I don't want to be just a cog in a machine. Something about, being able to see what I've created, that's important. So I am a kind of creative. That's more, something I'm passionate about. And that's what I need for my career passion. So the point is that these are born in your childhood. Okay, so he sets that, this is kind of what he's contemplating in we're reading the 1850 version here. That's what he's contemplating. Now, as he's contemplating this, he, asks himself about how nature had an impact on who he became as this very calm, demeanored person, and how he has these memories of nature, or how nature has an ability to do that. And he puts capital N nature, not just, how we might think of nature as just stuff out there, but almost like this force of nature. And he, says that nature can do this in very subtle ways and, small little things if you pay attention, but it can also do this in big, shocking ways that will, even at the time, leave an impression. And that's what leads us into the boat stealing scene from the 1850 Prelude. And I'll just set this up briefly by saying that Wordsworth is writing this in retrospect. So he's writing this as an adult, and he's talking about his childhood, and he's talking about a memory, or what he called a spot of time. This is like a little circle of your life, or a moment of your life that may or may not have had a momentous, life-changing event at the time, but that does serve as fodder for later recollections as part of the formation of your character. And I like the term spot of time, which he uses in the Prelude. You could read this as well in the 2-part Prelude. And because it kind of indicates, like, when you look at your life as in memory, you're only looking at a small portion of it. You're misremembering a lot of stuff. You don't remember everything, but you do probably have a sense of the totality of what's happening, or what happened at that time. But again, some of the particulars you may forget the names of people. You may, misremember that there was a bush here that you fell into and you forgot that happened because it was so irrelevant. And this is the essence of the concept of importance, right? And so a spot of time, because it kind of latches onto your memory and sticks out in your memory for some reason, holds an important, theme in your life, and can have a power in the formation of yourself and understanding yourself by simply contemplating it and thinking about how it relates to who you are, right? And so this is kind of, one of the first times that we get, this is pre-Freudian, the idea of like going back into your life and recollecting certain key events. Okay, so let's go into it. I'm going to read it once, and then we'll go through it, kind of line by line, not exactly. We'll go like sentence by sentence or so. Okay, so here we go. The boat stealing scene from the 1850 Prelude by William Wordsworth. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight I unloosed her chain, and stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on. Leaving behind her still, on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rose, proud of his skill, to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my eye upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the gray sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When, from behind the craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, a black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars, I turned and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. Then in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. O'er my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, or of sea or sky, no colors of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. Okay, that is the boat stealing sequence. It's one stanza. In the 1850 version, it's one continuing stanza just like this. In the 1805 version, he actually breaks up the stanza and he has a little bit more in there, I believe, in the 1805 version that he cut and rearranged some things. I think the 1850 version is actually a little bit better. There are times when I prefer the 1805 version for certain reasons, but the 1850 version tends to be the more clear one. It's, it seems to be the more, he knew what he wanted to get across a little bit more clearly. So it sometimes loses a little bit of the passion that is just kind of flowing out of him in the 1805 version, but it still retains, he retains a lot of that, of course, but he loses a little bit of it in trying to clarify. Okay, so let's go through this a little bit and see what we come up with. If it didn't make sense to you, that's fine. Understand, again, poetry is meant to be reread, not read. It's not meant to be read, it's meant to be reread. And this is an important idea in understanding poetry, is that the totality of the poem, in this case an excerpt, needs to be understood before the interpretation happens, which takes some time. And so reading it once, it's almost impossible to really interpret it fully. And to some degree, it may be that it's a lifelong, lifelong attempt to continue to interpret poetry. That's one of the great things about literature to some degree, is that you can, if it's a great poem, mine it over and over again as you age and experience life a little bit differently. So anyway, if it didn't make sense, don't be hard on yourself. So here we go. Let's go through this again. So one summer evening led by her is nature. One summer evening led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. So simple understanding here. We have, a boy who is led by nature, right? He's being not experiencing the world, but he's something is drawing him to this willow tree. And he says that it's led by her, nature. And, he sees on a willow tree in this rocky cove, this boat. Okay. Very simple action there. He's taking that action. Although some of it, you could, I guess, argue that he's being moved into that area by nature. And the next line is, straight I unloosed her chain and stepping in pushed from the shore. Straight I unloosed her chain and stepping in I pushed from the shore. So I think that's pretty simple too, right? It's just a way of saying he took the chain off that tied it to the willow tree and he stepped into it and he pushed himself away. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. He pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on. Now, the term troubled pleasures is a troubled pleasure is a really nice one. I think it says something about how, not just how pleasures are troubled in and of themselves, because sometimes they're not. Sometimes you enjoy a pleasure that you earned and it's a good pleasure and you don't feel anything about it. But he's saying at this time, he's a kid, he's stealing a boat or borrowing a boat without permission. He may even be out of the house without permission. And there is, if you think back to your youth, there is that feeling of there's a pleasure that you're enchaining, but you're always like, oh my gosh, I might get in trouble. There's a little bit of trouble around the corner. Like there's something wrong I'm doing. It's kind of, troubled pleasure is a really unique way to me of saying, enjoying a wrongdoing and having pleasure in the wrongdoing. So he is doing something wrong, right? It was an act of stealth. So he wasn't doing this out in the open for people to see. He didn't want people to see him because it wasn't right to some degree to steal that boat or to borrow the boat. Excuse me. Nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on. So as he's moving on, as he's feeling these things, he's hearing the mountain echoes, right? Just the sounds of nature. Leaving behind her still on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. leaving behind her still on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon. Well, is he actually hitting the moon with his oars? No, but if you think about the image, think about a camera shot, it's nighttime, there's a moon, it's going to be dark. So his oars are making these circles behind him as he's rowing and the moon is reflected on it. And so the moon is getting like this reflection circular look to it. And the circles, glittering idly in the moon. So they're not actually in the moon, they're in the reflection of the moon, but they kind of melt. So it melts into one track of sparkling light. So he's disrupting it. So if you think about him with his oars, disrupting the waters so that it's messing up the image of the moon. Okay, so that he's painting a picture, and I want to point out, because it's going to change in a little bit, I want to point out some of the images he's drawing here. So he's trying to give you, visuals of moon, but they're melting into something, right? So you have moon, you have mountain, you have stealth, you have the boat, you have the shore, you have the cove, the rocky cove, the willow tree. It's all these visuals of nature around him, but it's kind of, starting to, as he's traveling. We could talk about metaphors of traveling and how this is going into that, but that, might be something for later. And that's what's happening here. So you're getting these visuals, but he's moving into a new location. But now, like one who rows, proud of his skill, to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my eye upon the summit of a craggy ridge mountain, the horizon's utmost bound. So now, as he's rowing, he's disrupted the environment, but he's traveling into this new location. He's rowing, and he's proud of his rowing skill. Part of what he's doing is to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, he fixes his view on the summit the peak of a mountain. Excuse me. So he's, this is something like, as a navigator, he's proud of not only his rowing skill, but his navigation skill. We're going to talk about him going into maybe a fairyland in his imagination, but he's proud of his ability to move into this new location and to, in the dark, keep an unswerving line, on his boat, which sometimes isn't that easy when the water might be moving and you can't see anything. And he's using that like, some navigators out in the ocean might use the North Star. And next up, far above was nothing but the stars and the gray sky. So again, we're getting the horizon's utmost boundary. So the farthest he can see, and there's a boundary to it. And far above was not, all he could see was like just a blanket of gray sky. Remember, there's no light pollution back then. So if you've ever been to a location where there are no houses and lights, and you look up at the night sky, it is quite a bit different than what we are used to in our night sky if you live in the city. It's way different if you go far away from cities and you just look up. I mean, it is, especially if it's like a clear sky and you get up on a little bit on a mountain and you just look up, it's like, wow, it is a sight to see if you haven't seen that. Just all stars. And he's saying it's like a gray stars in this, a gray sky, the stars in the gray sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Okay, so pinnace means boat. So she was an elf boat. He's talking about his boat. And this is where, for me, I take it that he's now moving into the realm of imaginative myth. And again, so before all this, you have all these natural objects, but then all of a sudden you get an elfin boat. So his boat is transformed from a normal human boat into an elf boat, which is going to take him on a unique imaginative journey. Lustily, I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. So he's even comparing himself now to an animal. He is like a swan. And there's also a connotation with swan of, it's very graceful on the surface, but there's a lot going on under the surface, which is a part of what a good analogy or metaphor for the imagination. If you've ever seen someone just sitting under a tree and they're looking up, imagining something, they could be having a whole world of fighting and damsels in distress, or, princes or evil knights. And they could have these battles going on. All this could be such activity, but they're not moving. They're barely blinking. If you just looked at them, but like, what are you doing under that tree just sitting there, right? But there's a lot going on. And I think I like that image of going into this imaginative world, and he's a swan, or like a swan. Because again, there is that feeling of, if you were just watching him, he's just kind of rowing. There's not a lot going on, but there's a lot going on. When from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound. So horizon's bound, like the horizon had kind of held it back. It was binding it, like tying it up. So it was till then the horizon's bound. So let's read this again. When from behind that craggy steep mountain, when from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. So a huge peak upreared its head, right? That's the essence of the sentence. So when from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak upreared its head. What kind of peak? It's a black and huge peak. And it was as though it had, as if with voluntary instinct, upreared its head. So how did it uprear its head? As if with voluntary instinct. If you study grammar, it helps, by the way, because you could see how these sentences are actually complete sentences that are just kind of reconfigured than the normal syntax that we use, because sound isn't more important than clarity or than our normal syntax. But anyway, the point is voluntary power instinct. I love that phrase as well. Voluntary power instinct. Think about what that means. What would an involuntary power instinct be? Like an animal, right? Like squirrels have involuntary power instincts. They don't really, their instincts are kind of not voluntary. They're involuntary. It's just part of their nature. They gather nuts, they put them in their mouth, they bury them. They don't like think about why they do them or choose to do them. They just do them, right? They're determined. But the voluntary power instinct is unique to humans, or in this case, it's, you can think of unique to the great gods that we projected in literature. And in this case, it's now applicable to this huge peak. So this peak is now a thing, right? A thing that moves with free will like a human. So it's this huge black and huge, thing that's breaking its binds from the horizon, and it uprears its head. So we're really in this, I think a lot of people, when they read this, they may kind of just get into the cadence and they don't really take the time to visualize it. I mean, visualize that for a second. You got this thing, like a big, huge mountain. He's out in the dark by himself on this boat. I struck and struck again. What is he striking? He's striking the mountain? No, he's probably striking his oars still, right? But now it's changed. It's not gliding like a swan. He's like striking it. It's a fight, right? I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me, right? So he's striking again and again. He's trying to get away from it with his oars, like his boat, get away from it. And it, the thing growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between him. So imagine this almost like a cartoon. That's kind of how I see it. And the mountain kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And, like almost picture like a shadow with arms and a face and an eyes. And he doesn't describe that, but I think of that kind of idea. And the mountain looms up between him and the stars so that it blacks out everything. And still, for so it seemed, and it had a purpose of its own and measured motion like a living thing. I like that too. Measured motion like a living thing. Measured motion is how humans walk. We walk with measured motion. We walk with purpose of our own, right? Again, animals don't walk that way. So this is a kind of consciousness. Like when I walk, it's with a purpose to, like, I need to get to the grocery store. I want to get out of here, or I have a busy day, or I'm just going to meander around and, just kind of move here and, oh, look, that's interesting. And, or like, I got to get this done. Let me do, that's measured motion is, someone's got to get something done and they go like a living thing strode after me. With trembling oars, I turned and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the tree. So he's trembling. His arms are trembling so much that his oars are trembling. And he steals back to the covert of the tree. Again, we have that calling back to the stealth that got him into the boat. And now he's stealing back to the boat. And, so it's kind of a return to the beginning here of his little adventure. So that's his adventure right here. Water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There in the mooring place, I left my bark. That's the boat. So that is essentially the essence of the action that occurred. Really, all that happened is he took a boat, he went out in the middle of the water, and then he came back. Everything else is part of what we call the imagination, the fancy. So let's continue and see what happens to him after this event. And through the meadows homeward went in grave and serious mood. So, I take that as not only is, he's obviously looking down, forehead bent and contemplation, but he's also thinking about life and death. I don't think it's a coincidence he chose the word grave. So he could have just said in serious mood, but he says in grave and serious mood. Now, of course, we could think of he's in grave mood. Like that, then that guy looks like he's in a grave mood right now, which is kind of like he's in a serious, deep, contemplative, maybe even melancholy mood. That's what his behavior or his demeanor looks like. But again, the word grave, you cannot escape that it has graves, like gravestones. We're dead people. We put the dead. So I think there is a little bit of element where he's thinking about grave, and serious mood. And he's thinking about death, or at least that's somewhat on his mind. But after I had seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. What the heck of unknown modes of being? So, this makes sense. I had seen the spectacle of the mountain, the spectacle of the mountain. He had seen that for several days. So after this event, this sticks in his mind for days, even when he was a kid. And his brain worked this kind of dim, like the machinations of his brain, the subconscious, something behind the scenes, something behind the curtains is happening. And part of it is this, he's a kid, it's worked with, but there's this working of this dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. So, if you think about like a mode, like a conveyance, like like how am I going to get to New York City? You're going to drive, you're going to fly. So there's this mode of being that there's, you can walk and live like a normal human, or you can live in this imaginative state, or there's another mode of being, or there's some, again, I think he doesn't know what it is, but he senses an undetermined sense that there is something unique, something that he doesn't grasp yet as a kid, right? That there is this thing that's working on him that's like, there's something there. I don't know what it is. There's something in nature. There's something in me, but there's another way to live life. There's a totally different conveyance of experiencing existence. O'er my thoughts, there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. So, again, he's reflecting, he's saying, my thoughts, there was this darkness, and this darkness maybe was just solitude and what happens with solitude, which is to think to yourself. And there's this kind of empty isolation. There's empty abandonment, right? Blank desertion. So it seems like, he's feeling, he's not sure some of the means and modes that he had been taught, perhaps, that came before him, that he was taught that, in solitude, he realizes that maybe there's another mode of being, right? It doesn't come from other people. It comes from himself. And so there's a feeling of maybe there's some kind of empty abandonment from the people that he knew and his parents and, the people who taught him. That maybe he doesn't define it. He just says there's this darkness. You can call it solitude or blank desertion, empty abandonment. No familiar shapes remained. no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colors of green fields. So, he's saying that the shapes, all those images, the willow trees, a lot of that has kind of faded. A lot of that's gone. There's no pleasant images of trees. All that, when he's contemplating this, in the solitude, in the blank desertion, the darkness that hung, over his thoughts, those particulars disappeared. And what I think replaces it, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, move slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. So the form, the essence of this of this event and what it meant to him and what it did to him, that's what remains. And he thinks about it during the day, and it troubles him at night during his sleep. Okay. Now, this is one excerpt. So it's, hard to give a full analysis because to some degree, this is just one small stanza in book, I think it's in book 1 of the Prelude, where he's talking about his childhood experiences. And this is one profound spot of time that, he thinks about when it comes to the formation of who he is. And there's going to be a lot. He's going to go into more of his school time at Hoxhead Grammar School. He's going to talk about Cambridge. He's going to talk about his travels and going on a walking tour in the early 90s. He's going to talk about going into Europe. He's going to talk about going into France. He's going to talk about revolutionary France. He's going to go into all these events of his life. That's what the whole epic of the Prelude is about. And he's going to be exploring it in this kind of way where, he's thinking that there's something here, that something is going to be developed as he goes, and he's going to have a conclusion where he has concluding thoughts. And along the way, he kind of has thoughts about what do books have to say about, what about my teachers? What did they do in the formation? And what did I do? And what did my imagination and fancy have, to do with the formation of who I am, my interest, and particularly the powers of my poetic mind. It's a very fantastic book. I probably understand about 2% of it, even though I've studied it quite intensely to some degree. I mean, it is a book that requires and calls for endless rereading. And in a sense, this is such a good thing. I mean, I hope with this boat scene, you see at least, the experience. I'll leave you with this, the experience of childhood. And that you can, in reading this, you can get a feeling of the awe, the terror that that you probably felt and have forgotten a lot about in your own childhood. And in the way he's showing you this, and if you read, especially some of the Prelude, even the first 2 books, like I said, the 2-part Prelude, I should say, that you can get a sense of a new way to kind of analyze your own self and to kind of look into your own soul and think about how your ideas were formed. Go back into time and the way that he did, right? You may not be able to write it quite as eloquently as he does here, but you could still use this as a tool to kind of think about the formation of your own self. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. Return to the boat scene. It's a good one. And, please try and tell me try and read the 2-part Prelude. And if you do, let me know.